Welcome to our latest installment of the Rabbi's video blogs, in which I interview members of our congregation, some of whom are familiar to everybody, some quite new or obscure. But the idea is for us to get to know one another, even though we are separated by distance and, of course, by circumstances. Today, I am very happy to be joined by the Adelmans, who have returned to Chicago so they could be a little bit closer to their family. And again, as some of you may know them very well, Neil has been a very active member of our congregation in that he has shared his knowledge and his passion for learning with us during our lecture series. And so today I thought we could learn more from them. How are you?
We're fine.
Yes? How was
Good
the
to see
trip
you,
back
Rep.
home? How was your trip back to Chicago?
We had been very concerned about that. We drove and we were very pleased. It turned out to be a very easy trip.
Right.
And places we stayed were all very careful, and it worked out very well.
Good. Did you quarantine yourselves upon arrival?
More or less. We had an empty house with no food, so
Right.
we had to do some shopping for that. But we pretty much did.
Yeah, we stayed close to home. Just did what was necessary.
Good, good. Well, as you probably have seen from other interviews I've done, I always try to start by asking people to situate us in their historical background. Tell us a little bit about your families. How did you end up in Chicago, the Midwest, etc.?
Yeah. My father's family, my grandparents came from Odessa. My grandfather had 4 sons here in the United States, with my grandmother, who was from Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
And both of my parents were born here in the States, met here in the States. And my mother had 3 brothers. And that's pretty much it on my side.
Okay.
But where were they settled when they arrived?
Chicago.
Really? Why
Yes.
Chicago?
I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know. But they met here in Chicago. And I don't know, much about anything before that.
Correct. What was the last name?
Well,
Oh, that's a story.
that's a story in itself. Their name, we think, was Mamrufsky, but we're not sure. At some period of time, my father's oldest brother changed the name to Nemirov.
Mm-hmm.
The reason being, as best we know, was that each brother was spelling the name differently, so that no one was quite sure what the name was. One thought was that it might have been Mam Nemirovsky or Mamrovsky, but anyway, the bottom line is they settled on Nemirov.
Right. I don't know how much you know about the etymology of the names. Rovsky usually means son of, right? And Nemer or Memerovsky is probably a patronym to a family of people who were teachers, who were narrators of the tradition to kids and to others. There's different names to that. So it's possible that the family had some background in the Middle Ages with, let's call it, with education or books or something like that sort of stuck with them. But again, I'm just conjecturing. I have no clue what the true facts could have been. But that's just so you know a little bit about that thing. The idea that people change names to make them easier, of course, is not new to us. My own grandfather, who came from Lithuania, had a very complicated name that he shortened to Chorny, which is the word for black in Russian. That's it. Because he understood that the Colombian authorities, who only know Spanish, couldn't pronounce whatever name there was. And much to my chagrin and disappointment, I don't know what the real name was. Hence, I've never been able to trace the family history. So it's a good thing that at least you have so many people that you could have polled about it. How about you, Neil?
Well, all four of my grandparents came from, came in that large migration between the 1880s and early 1900s. On my father's side, I don't know, other than Russia, where my grandfather came from. My grandmother apparently came with her mother in 1903 from Kishinev. And that was the year of the pogrom, the first pogrom there. I don't know if they came before or after, but my guess is very likely they came afterwards to get away from there. I know more about my mother's family. They came from a town called Mariampol, which, depending what year it was either in Lithuania, Poland, or Russia. And that was, my grandfather was the oldest of 9 children. He came in the 1880s, and eventually all of his siblings and his parents came. My grandmother was from a neighboring town, Suwałki. At one point, I don't know why, but they lived in Plano, Illinois, which is a small town downstate. I remember an aunt telling me that they used to go and get kosher meat that got brought in by the train.
Right.
And yeah, they must have moved to New York at one point because my mother was born in New York. And then they moved back to Chicago, and they had a women's ready-to-wear clothing retail establishment in downtown Chicago. And as a little kid, I went there to the store many times. Knew that well.
But yet again, no reason why Illinois?
No, I don't know. I don't know if there were any other relatives that were here previously, but obviously they left at one point and went to New York, but came back.
Right. Well, I can share with you an anecdote. I don't know how familiar you are with The Fiddler on the Roof, with the movie, etc.
Oh, yes.
Well, at the end of the narrative, they're all closing shop in their houses, etc., because they've been forced out of Anatevka, right? And in the march, somebody asked Tevye, so where are you going? Oh, I'm going to Chicago, America. So I guess in those days, people knew New York and Chicago, America. And that's where they came. Now, the roads, the rivers, the trains to Illinois were quite advanced at the time. The trails were already open. So maybe that's why. I really don't know. Very nice. Well, obviously you are 100% Midwesterns, Illinoisers. So tell me a little bit about yourselves.
Okay, well, I went to, we're kind of a mixed marriage because Judy's from the north side and I'm from the south side, and those are very different communities. I went to the high school at the University of Chicago, and then I went there for college, and then law school. Thinking about this interview after you asked us, Rabbi, and watching some of the interviews, I thought of my Jewish education, which was, I think, different from other interviewees and many of our members. I went to a Reform Sunday school and Hebrew school, but other than that, there was absolutely nothing done in my home. It was completely secular. Yeah, if anything, we lit Hanukkah candles because I brought one of those little tin menorahs and orange candles home from Sunday school. So that was really all. I was bar mitzvahed, but they did those on a Friday evening.
Right.
And I did not, I read a section from the Torah. It was actually Bereshit, and then read it in English and gave a little talk, but no Haftorah at all.
Right.
And really went to services very, very infrequently, principally Yisker on Yom Kippur after my mother had died. And it wasn't until we were living in Wilmette and just decided that our older daughter should go to Sunday school. I wasn't very interested in Hebrew school, but Sunday school. And we ended up joining a conservative synagogue, which was definitely not what I had in mind, but it was the closest to us geographically, where some of our neighbors went and we could carpool with them.
Correct.
And we had gone to 2 Friday night services there to hear the speakers. This was a somewhat unusual, very small congregation. One speaker was a rather controversial Black Catholic priest who had made quite a name for himself in Chicago. And the other was a very liberal Chicago lawyer who had just written a report condemning the Chicago police for what had happened in 1968 with the convention and the
Right.
what happened at the Democratic convention there. Those were the things that got us to Friday night services.
Hey, whatever it works.
And then caused us to join a couple of years later when our daughter started Hebrew school.
But
Wonderful.
the interesting thing is that the synagogue became, with time, a very, very major part of our life.
Why would you say that is?
Well, we started out going to Friday night services. Our daughters enjoyed going with us because, interestingly enough, when the rabbi gave a sermon, there was a young couple that took the children out and did some things with them, and our kids loved going. And so that encouraged, really encouraged us to all go as a family. And in doing so, we met a number of people that we became friendly with.
Sure.
We became part of a Havurah that has been in existence over 30 years. And really, over the time, Neil and I both served on the board. Neil was president. I was a secretary. It was a major part of our life.
That's
and
wonderful.
One of which we still enjoy.
It's wonderful to hear. It also parallels the history and the experience of a lot of American Jews whose parents, for reasons that I cannot even try to understand, sort of led a very liberal life, but they came back because the shul served as that axis for social, educational, cultural life.
Well, Neil and I actually grew up very differently.
Tell me about your background.
It was very different than Neil's. My parents lived culturally a very Jewish life. We kept a kosher home. We lived in a Jewish neighborhood. All of our friends were Jewish. As far as I knew growing up, everybody was Jewish. That was our existence. But we weren't, quote, religious. We didn't belong to a synagogue. My father, who had grown up with his 3 brothers going to a yeshiva, either a yeshiva or a Jewish school.
Cheder?
I'm not sure just what it was, but they all came out of it pretty much rejecting doing anything religiously. So here I was, in terms of joining a synagogue. My father refused. So my mother joined a sisterhood, which then allowed me to go to Sunday school. And everything I knew was Jewish. I was told from day one that I would not be allowed to date any boy that was not Jewish. And it was my clear understanding that this was the way it was going to be.
Right. It was an ethnic, nationalistic feeling of belonging.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
And one that was very important to me.
Right. So, what did your mom do with that affiliation to the sisterhood? Did she transmit something new to you? Did she discover something new?
No, it just really, gave her the opportunity to do some things with other Jewish women as a
Correct.
part of it. And it allowed me to go to Sunday school.
Sure. How did your father earn a living?
He actually owned a company that made neckties,
Mm-hmm.
which today would probably not do very well.
Why not? I mean, you'd be well, maybe because of China. Yeah.
Times have changed.
Wonderful,
But,
wonderful.
yeah.
So, where did you meet? In college? Outside of college?
I was actually in high school, and Neil and I met on a blind date. His fraternity.
Yeah, one of my fraternity brothers, a good friend, who subsequently became a rabbi.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. We met through him and his girlfriend.
So you've built a life together. You have how many daughters?
We have 2 girls.
And they're in Chicago area?
No. One is living in Denver
Right.
with her family, and the other is in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Wow. So
Yeah.
you have a similar experience to me. I have grandkids in Tucson, Arizona, and Los Angeles. And somebody asked me a couple of days ago, what am I looking forward the most these days? And I said, I just want to look forward to making plans to go. I don't want to, I'm not even thinking of going, but just the possibility of making plans, because right now it's impossible, right? So how have you coped with that?
Well, initially, we all got together a lot on Zoom.
Right.
We actually would have had 3 graduations. We had planned to leave Naples in late April because we had a graduate school graduation that about April 30th. 2 weeks later, a college graduation, and then a high school graduation the beginning of June. They were all virtual. Yeah, they were all virtual, of course, but we all met. We all celebrated them with Zoom, and as best we could.
Right.
We talked to our daughters. This didn't used to be the case, but since everything shut down, we talked to each of them virtually every day, pretty much every day.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
One of them is an MD, and early on, she was quite helpful. Well, we were really pretty scared and trying to figure out what to do in some, day-to-day kind of things. She was very helpful.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm happy to see that you also have found a little silver lining in that, yes, this technology has allowed us to narrow sometimes those gaps and so on and so forth. Wonderful. As I said at the top, Neil, you have been very gracious to share with us your interest in the many different topics that you've researched. But of course, you are a lawyer, and you always will be a lawyer. And I've heard from you privately a lot of stories from days right out of school where you were a clerk for judges, and some of those judges became important in American jurisprudence. What can you share with us so we get to know you better?
Well, after law school, I just clerked for one judge. He was on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. His name was David Bazelon. He was originally a Chicagoan. Lawyers that are seeing this may recognize his name. He was quite liberal. He was a Truman appointee, and he made quite a name for himself in the field of mental health. He came up with a different definition in criminal cases initially for insanity, a much more modern definition. and he continued to be very involved in the mental health field as it intersected with the law throughout his entire career. Very, very interesting, very amazing man. I'm in Naples because of my clerkship, because another one of the clerks,
I know who.
whose office was next door to me, was Stan Lipnick.
Correct.
And Stanley and I became friends. We were at his and Judy's wedding. After we moved, he and Judy were native Washingtonians.
Correct.
But after we moved back to Chicago, we pretty much lost contact with them until one day I walked out of a building on LaSalle Street where in the rain, where most of the Chicago lawyers' offices were, and ran into Stan, who had just been there for an interview and accepted a job to come and join a law firm in Chicago. So that clearly renewed our friendship. And we first came to Naples at their strong request. And we've been back every winter since then. That was probably 2010, I would think, 2010 or 11.
Let me give you a little preview. You know how on TV they try to give you a preview of what's coming next week or so? Judy has agreed to be interviewed as well because she has an incredible background, having grown up in DC and so on. She served as director of research for a couple of very important military operations, and then she had her own business. We'll learn a lot from her. So thank you for allowing me to segue and introduce her as well. So this judge influenced your career? Did it affect how you turned out?
It certainly strengthened my liberal inclinations. And it's interesting, a very close friend of his in Washington, who also was from Chicago, was Arthur Goldberg.
Sure.
And when my clerkship was over, I went to work for a very large, it was the largest law firm in Washington. And I was there for close to a year, but then the military caught up with me. And I went into an Air Force Reserve program and was trained in Texas to be an aircraft mechanic.
Not a JAG officer?
No, I was an enlisted man. I had actually been actually applied for a program in Air Force JAG where you were in the military, but you worked as a civilian in the Pentagon.
Right.
But that hadn't come through, and this program in the reserves came through, and I went into that. And while I was in the service, Judy had gone back home to live with her parents. And while I was in the service...
This is the early 1960s, I assume?
This is 1962. This is the first 6 months of 1962. We decided to come back to Chicago, which we did. And I decided I wanted to go to work for a small law firm after having been with a very large firm. And the firm that I went with was the firm, very highly regarded, very small firm, the firm that Arthur Goldberg had founded in Chicago. And still had a connection with him because this was a little before he became Secretary of Labor. And I was very interested in doing labor law work on the union side, which this firm did, along with having a business practice.
Sure.
I ended up doing, in the early years of my practice, a fair amount of labor work, but it turned out that most of it was on the management side. And then I had a very, very practice with this firm. One of the most interesting parts was in the 60s and 70s, I did a lot of First Amendment work. A principal client of ours was a magazine publisher that had a lot of censorship problems from time to time. So I would, they'd be in various parts of the country and some were international, and I would prepare the defense for a local lawyer. We always wanted a local lawyer. A few cases I tried myself. Some I just went to and was present, or I would be preparing the witnesses, be setting things up. And sometimes we would even sue prosecutors who were threatening to have threatening retailers. I had a thought a couple of weeks ago during one of your classes. You mentioned Ruth Jason's brother.
Correct.
And who had argued a case in the Supreme Court. And he was a friend of mine and a law school classmate. And I remember thinking at the time, my job was to stay out of the Supreme Court. Right. Which the last thing we wanted to do was to end up having our publication in the Supreme Court. And I was successful in that. We managed to win all of our cases and the cases below. And the only time somebody threatened to go to the Supreme Court, we were managed to keep it out of the Supreme Court.
Neil, you must know that everybody who is looking at this is standing on pins and needles to know which was the magazine. Everybody's thinking Playboy.
Playboy.
Was it?
Playboy. Yes.
Yeah, that's the first one that came to mind. So did you ever meet Mr. Hefner?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. Quite a character. I'm sure you have lots of stories. Wonderful. Wow, that's incredible. You opened the world to a lot of interesting reading. Everybody only bought it for the articles, right?
For the interviews.
It's right. That's very nice. Very nice. Tell me something about your Jewish interests. We've learned about your early life and, of course, building a Jewish family in Chicago. You were president of your shul. Tell me more.
I was always interested in Jewish history, in biblical and more recent Jewish history. Was interesting. I worked most Saturdays. Mm-hmm. When I wasn't working, I found it very interesting to go to services. The services at this small synagogue we belonged to at that point were very different. We didn't have any cantor, and there really wasn't a regular Saturday morning service unless there was a bar or bat mitzvah. It was completely egalitarian, which was a little unusual at that time. And the big service was Friday evening. But what it was on Saturday morning, there were a group of men, I think there maybe was one woman, otherwise all men, who were all very knowledgeable, and they and the rabbi would just discuss the parsha. Right. And I used to go, and I found that that to be very interesting. Both of us did a lot more in terms of Jewish education after we retired, and we've really done some really good things after we both retired together, which we were told was not necessarily a good idea, but that was 17 years ago. It was the end
of June. What did you retire from, Judith?
Oh, yes, I had taught school. I had taught first grade in the area we lived in, the suburb that we were living in, for I think 27 years.
So you learn how to read all right.
Right. So we retired together, and that's when we really began to do some very interesting things. One thing I did was I volunteered at Jewish Family Children and Family Services in their school. They had a school that had two sections to it. One was a yeshiva.
Mhm.
The second was a school for children in the public schools or anywhere that the schools were not able to meet their needs. It was mostly emotional problems. And I volunteered in that section of it for many years.
As an educator, as a docent?
As an educator, yes. And it was a wonderful experience. Did that for many years after we retired. And then another thing that we did, and I'm going to let Neil tell you more about it, and we are still doing, is we bring every year, it's called American Friends of Israel War Disabled Foundation, very awkward name. But every year we bring 10 disabled soldiers from Israel to the United States for 2 weeks of R&R.
Incredible. That's sweet. I think I've heard Neil speak about it, but I thought it was just an anecdote. I didn't know you were quite so involved with that.
Oh, I'll let Neil tell you about
Yeah.
it because he had been president of it for a while.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
This is a small, completely independent organization. Although there are a number of other organizations like this that do the same thing in the New York area, in Canada, and some in Europe. It's connected with the Zahal Disabled Veterans Organization in Israel. And it was already in existence when we joined. A friend who was already involved told us about it. It was shortly after we retired. It sounded very interesting. The group funds 100% the expense of bringing this group of veterans, including the airfare and everything for the 2 weeks that they're in the Chicago area. And they stay in our houses. For 9 years, we had a guest until we really moved out of our house into our condo. For 7 years, we had somebody for the full 2 weeks. And for the first year and the last year, we did it for just 1 of the 2 weeks. And we take them to all the tourist sites in Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry, Navy Pier, the other museums, a tour of the city.
These tours are on a one-to-one or as groups?
No, it's as a group. We rent a 15-person van and we schlep them around. It is an extremely hectic 2 weeks.
Are they ambulatory or they're wheelchair bound?
No, they're all ambulatory. There are often ones on crutches, often ones who have to use a wheelchair. Some of the time, there are other programs we learned in other cities where the entire group is wheelchair bound and each vet comes with an assistant.
Correct.
Who helps him or her. Most of them are men, but there are some are women. There's been a number of women. Again, most of them, but not all of them, are Jewish. We've met Druzim and gotten to know them, who are very, very interesting, and also a couple of Bedouins who serve in the IDF, which is not the usual situation for Bedouins. I think virtually all of the Druze men serve in the military. That is expected of them, and many of them go into law enforcement.
And they do it with great distinction, actually.
Yes, yes. We were hosts in our home to to 9 of them, all very interesting, some very different. One fella had been a POW in Syria after the Yom Kippur War. And I don't remember how long Danny was in Syria. Was it just?
I think it was over a year.
Oh, I think over a year. Another one of them was still in the IDF. It sounded from his description of his career that he'd been something like a Navy SEAL before. And what he did now was he piloted drones from his office in Tel Aviv. One of them had been a lieutenant colonel who led his troops into Ramallah when they had to go in there, and really that was a very difficult experience, and I think is what led to some of his disabilities. And when he was with us, he was just a wonderful guy. It was a very, very interesting group, and then we, of course, we got to know some of the ones that weren't staying with us also.
Of course.
So
have you been back to Israel and had an opportunity to have a reunion? That
yes,
must be very exciting.
In 2000,
Look at Judy's face light up.
Yeah,
it was wonderful.
we went in December of 2008. We did it really for 2 reasons. We had reunions with the 5 of them that we'd hosted before, and we met several of their families. And we also toured the Beit Halohem, which is called the House of the Warrior, facilities that they have both in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
And it's like the VA over there.
Yes, and we also we were there. We were both taking the Melton 2-year educational program at the time, and we did the Melton Israel program for about 10 days or so. Whether it was
2, well,
yeah, maybe close to
3 weeks. So
yeah.
I think it was 2 weeks, and then we added another week to our trip.
Wonderful. Did you ever go there with your daughters?
Yes. The first time we went was we were supposed to go over the winter vacation in 1973 on an Ort tour with our kids who were very young at the time, and we had to pay our money at the point where things were still not clear from the Yom Kippur War. So we didn't do that, but we went over the following spring vacation, which coincided with Pesach. So that was like a 2-week, very good introductory tour all around Israel. And then our older daughter, when she was a junior in college, did a semester at Tel Aviv University. And we went and visited her there then for about 10 days or so. In the 90s, and this was because of a something I heard at services one time, I became a parachaplain. And I got a little bit of training for that and a kind of a book to use as a service. I did the whole service the first time. This was at nursing homes on Friday evening. Doing the whole service, I learned quickly was a mistake. I abbreviated it greatly. And I did that for about 6 or 7 years.
That's interesting. That's phenomenal. Wow, what a story. How varied and how special. Well, I don't want to take more of your time because today, as we are taping, is Friday. You are an hour earlier, so you have time to go do things, but we have to start getting ready for Shabbat in our neighborhood. This week, we read an interesting portion of Balak. And last week, we read Chukat, and we spoke about the fact that this prophet that was hired to curse the people turned out that he blessed them. And those are the famous words, Ma Tovu, which we all know. I think that on the eve of the 4th of July, as you and I are talking, we could do with something like that, a special blessing for our country on its day of independence and celebration, and pray that everybody will be safe and get together physically in the near future. So with that, I want to again thank you, wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and ask you if you have one last thought that you want to leave us with.
Just that this evening, we are going to Shabbat in the lot. Our
Nice.
synagogue here is having Friday evening services at 6 p.m. in the parking lot next to the synagogue, where everybody is to be either in their car, spaced apart, or they can get out of the car and be right next to it if they are wearing a mask.
Right.
They did this 2 weeks ago, and it was a great success. And we're going to go this evening. So we wish Shabbat Shalom to everybody.
Thank you. Well, I'm beginning to prepare for the high holidays, and one of the things we are probably going to be doing here in Naples is a drive-through shofar service outdoors. So let me know how the service works outdoors in Chicago. Maybe we can replicate the successes for our congregation here.
We've talked about that, doing that same thing
Yeah.
in Chicago.
All right. You both look great. Continue taking good care of yourself. And thanks for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you
Rabbi.
very much for giving us this opportunity.
Shabbat
All right.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.